Have you ever wondered why a man's silence after you walk away feels heavier than the loudest argument he ever threw at you? Why the sudden quiet becomes a battlefield, not of words, but of the shadows in his own mind? When you leave first, you pierce the illusion he has carefully built. The illusion that he was always in control, that you would always orbit around his gravity. And in that moment, his ego, that fragile mask made of steel and glass, begins to fracture. A man's ego does not die loudly, it dies in whispers, in private corners of his psyche he never wanted to confront. He may laugh in public, appear indifferent, even move on quickly with someone new. But within him something deeper stirs, an ancient wound. Jung called it the shadow. The disowned part of himself he hides not only from you, but from his own reflection. When you leave first, you awaken that shadow. He begins to question whether he was ever enough, whether the power he thought he held was merely a performance staged for his own fragile self-image. Most women underestimate this power. They believe leaving means disappearing into nothingness, when in reality, departure is its own form of fire. To leave first is to remind him that the stage collapses without the audience. His applause, his dominance, his performance, they all depended on your willingness to remain. And when you step away, he is forced to confront the hollowness behind the curtain. But here is where the story turns darker. Because the ego, when wounded, rarely surrenders in peace. It seeks distraction, projection, and control. He may demonize you, rewriting the narrative so that he can remain the hero of his story. He may call you cold, ungrateful, disloyal, not because these words hold truth, but because his ego cannot bear to admit its own insufficiency. In Jungian terms, this is projection, the disowned weakness within himself hurled outward onto you. And if you are not careful, you will carry his shadows as if they were your sins. Do you see the danger here? To leave is powerful, but to absorb his projected shame is a slow erosion of your own worth. You must remember, the storm inside him is not your responsibility to calm. The shadow he battles is not your burden to carry. You were the mirror. You were the trigger. You were never the origin. His ego hides behind masks of anger, indifference, even sudden charm, but all of it is defense, a desperate attempt to avoid looking inward. Some women, sensing this inner collapse, feel tempted to return. They mistake his silence for strength, his anger for passion, his new distractions for healing. But understand this, a man's first reaction after you leave is not his truth. It is his armor. His truth comes later, in the long quiet nights when there is no one left to impress. That is when his ego confronts its own mortality. That is when the shadow creeps closer. And that is when he either evolves or he repeats the cycle with someone new. This is where you, the woman who chose to leave first, stand at a threshold. Do you step back into his chaos to soothe his unhealed wounds, or do you step forward into your own becoming, knowing his unraveling is not yours to mend? Lao Tzu once said, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." That is the essence of your departure. In letting go, you do not diminish yourself. You expand into something freer, something unchained from the constant labor of holding his ego together. What would you think if I told you that his greatest fear is not losing you, but losing the mirror you provided? Because without you, he cannot escape his reflection. He cannot hide from his own emptiness. That is why he fights so hard to paint you as the villain. It is easier than facing the truth that his sense of self depended on you staying. And so when you leave first, you do more than break a relationship. You fracture the mythology he built about himself. You expose the cracks in his persona. You remind him, in silence more than in words, that control was never his to begin with. The question then is not what his ego hides, but whether you will fall for the illusions it creates after you go, because his ego will craft every story it can to pull you back into orbit. But your power lies in remembering you are not the shadow he fears, you are the light that revealed it. When the woman leaves first, something ancient stirs in the man's psyche, not simply grief, but an assault on the very architecture of his identity. His ego, that brittle scaffolding holding up the facade of strength, crumbles under the weight of abandonment. In his mind, he was always the one who would decide when the curtain fell. For her to end the act disrupts the illusion that he was the master of the stage, and when control slips from his hands, a deeper fear awakens. The fear of insignificance. Carl Jung taught that the ego is but a small island floating on the vast ocean of the unconscious. Beneath it lie forgotten memories, archetypal instincts, and unacknowledged shame. The moment she departs, his island begins to flood. He feels the waters rise in the form of jealousy, rage, or despair. Yet he does not show these tides directly. He cloaks them in distractions, new conquests, loud laughter, boasts of freedom. To the world, he appears untouchable. To himself, he whispers questions he cannot answer. Why wasn't I enough? Why did she leave first? What part of me was so unworthy she could walk away without fear? This is the hidden torment. He does not miss her only for her presence. He misses the reflection of himself he once saw in her eyes. She validated his importance, confirmed his masculinity, held together the cracks he refused to see. Now, stripped of her gaze, he stares into mirrors that reflect nothing but absence, and in that emptiness, the shadow prowls. The shadow is cruel because it speaks the truths the ego cannot tolerate. It whispers of his failures, his cowardice, the ways he postured rather than loved. It tells him that the power he once wielded was fragile theatre, dependent on her willingness to remain. This is why men often collapse into either fury or numbness when left, for the shadow is merciless in its honesty. He is faced with his own nakedness, and it terrifies him. But here lies the paradox. The very wound he resists is also the path to his transformation. Jung called it individuation, the process of integrating shadow and light, ego and soul. If he were wise, he would thank her departure, for it forced him into confrontation with himself. Yet wisdom is rare in those first days of loss. Most men instead build higher walls, mask themselves in pride, or rush into the arms of distraction. Do you see the subtle cruelty of this pattern? He cannot admit that you left because something in him was broken, so he crafts a narrative that protects his pride. He convinces himself you were never loyal, that you were cold, that you feared intimacy. These are the projections of an ego bleeding, and if you listen too closely, you may begin to believe them, carrying his wounds as if they were your flaws. But understand this, what he accuses you of is often the very thing he cannot face in himself. When he calls you selfish, it is because he was unwilling to give. When he calls you unloving, it is because he withheld his own heart. When he paints you as the betrayer, it is because he betrayed his own soul long before you walked away. This is why your leaving is not simply an ending, it is an initiation. You are initiated into the strength of detachment, into the clarity of seeing what his ego hides, into the courage of walking without waiting for permission, and he is initiated into his confrontation with the mirror, though whether he faces it or runs will be his choice alone. The Stoics knew this truth well. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." When you leave, you reveal the poverty of his craving, the hunger for control, the addiction to being needed, the thirst for admiration. You strip him of the illusion that possession equals love, and whether he learns from that stripping or hides behind it determines the man he will become. But let us turn the gaze toward you for a moment. To walk away first is no small act. It requires the death of an old identity, the courage to disappoint, the willingness to bear the loneliness of choosing yourself. The woman who leaves first is not merely fleeing, she is reclaiming. She refuses to be the mirror for a man who cannot face his own reflection. She refuses to carry the weight of a shadow not her own. She chooses to step into the unknown rather than live in the false safety of control. And though his ego hides in silence, anger, or quick replacements, remember, none of these masks are truth. They are performances for survival. The truth remains unspoken, whispered only in his darkest solitude, and that truth is this: your leaving shattered the illusion that he was unshakable. In the void you left behind, he meets himself, and it terrifies him more than losing you ever could. When the silence stretches long after your departure, he begins to sense something he cannot name, a disorientation, as if the compass of his identity has been stolen. The man who once believed himself sovereign now feels tall. The invisible gravity of loss pulling him into unfamiliar territory. His ego, which once stood as his shield, grows restless, whispering that if you could leave first, then perhaps he was never the center of the story. That whisper is unbearable, so he drowns it in noise. He will cloak himself in new rituals, new people, even new lovers, hoping the hollow space you left will be filled by imitation. But these imitations rarely soothe. Instead, they magnify the void. For every smile he fakes, there is a deeper echo of your absence. Every conquest only amplifies his sense of disposability. This is the cruel alchemy of projection. The more he denies his wound, the larger it grows, feeding on the very distractions he uses to suppress it. Jung warned of this cycle. The man who refuses to meet his shadow repeats the same patterns endlessly, disguising avoidance as freedom. And here is the truth. His ego hides most ferociously. He does not miss you alone. He misses the version of himself that existed in your presence. You made him feel significant, desired, unchallenged. Without you, the mask of his identity loosens, and he begins to realize how much of his power depended on your willingness to stay. And you, the woman who walked away, may still feel his pull. There will be moments when his silence feels like punishment, when his quick rebound feels like proof that you were replaceable. But pause. Look deeper. The man who leaps immediately into new arms is not healed. He is haunted. His rush to fill the emptiness is not proof of strength but fear of stillness, for stillness would force him to face the shadow, to confront the possibility that without you he must build himself anew. This is why you must hold firm. His games, his silence, his performance, none of these are truth. The truth is buried in his midnight hours, in the thoughts that creep when he lies awake. It is there, in the solitude he tries to escape, that his ego unravels. It is there he asks himself why you left, why he could not keep you, and whether he ever truly held the power he pretended to own. Seneca once wrote, "He suffers more than necessary, who suffers before it is necessary." This describes the man left behind. Even as he clings to denial, he suffers twice, once for the wound itself, and once more for refusing to face it. His ego, desperate to protect itself, crafts illusions, that he never cared, that he chose the ending, that his pride remains intact. But illusions cannot feed the soul. They are smoke, and eventually smoke clears, leaving behind the charred remnants of truth. And here lies the deeper lesson for you. His unraveling is not your responsibility. Too many women mistake his collapse for a call to return, to soothe, to mother him through the storm. But you are not his savior. You are his mirror. You revealed what he could not bear to see. And if he chooses to turn away from the reflection, that is his path, not yours. Your power lies in resisting the temptation to absorb his projections, to accept his rewriting of the story. Your worth is not diminished by his denial. It is illuminated by your courage to leave first. Understand this. Leaving first is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of clarity. You chose not to drown in the illusions of his ego, not to sacrifice your becoming for his denial. In doing so, you stepped into a realm that frightens him most, freedom. For freedom cannot be controlled, cannot be owned, cannot be used as a mirror for another man's pride. And though his ego hides this truth beneath layers of performance, it festers within him. He knows he lost not just you, but the version of himself that thrived in your presence. And so the question lingers, will he face the shadow, or will he build another stage, another mask, another illusion? That answer will always belong to him, but for you, the answer is already written. You have stepped beyond the cycle of control into the realm of self-possession. The power lies not in whether he ever admits his truth, but in the fact that you no longer need his admission to validate your worth. For the greatest illusion the ego hides, his and sometimes even yours, is that leaving means losing. In reality, leaving first means awakening. There comes a moment, after the first storms of denial and distraction, when his silence deepens into something more dangerous. Not the outward silence that tries to impress you with indifference, but the inner silence that begins to rot. A man who has been left first must face the truth that terrifies him most. He is not invincible. His ego told him he was always the one who would decide the ending. Your departure shattered that myth, and in the rubble lies the raw truth of his dependency. The ego cannot survive long without a mirror, and when you take that mirror away, he begins to lose the image of himself that once felt powerful. He is left with his naked shadow. Jung taught that when a man refuses to confront this darkness, he will seek substitutes. He may throw himself into work, chasing achievements to prove his worth. He may surround himself with admirers, basking in attention to cover his emptiness. He may even drown himself in pleasures, mistaking stimulation for intimacy. Yet in every pursuit, the same ghost follows him, the ghost of the self he cannot face. This is why his actions after you leave feel both loud and hollow. You may see him flaunt his freedom, parade his new desires, or act as though your absence barely touched him. But remember, performance is not healing. His ego is desperate to hide the fracture, and in doing so, it only widens. For every boast of strength, there is an unspoken cry. If I act unbroken long enough, maybe I will forget that I am. But he does not forget. The unconscious does not allow erasure. It demands integration. The wound waits for him in the quiet, in the moments between distractions, when his laughter fades, when the bed grows cold, when no one is watching. The truth returns. It whispers that he was abandoned not because of your weakness, but because of his refusal to grow. That is what his ego hides most, not grief for you, but shame at himself. Do you see how profound your leaving truly was? It did not simply remove you from his world, it dismantled his architecture of control. The archetypal masculine thrives on conquest, but your departure revealed the hollowness of conquest without depth. He lost not only your presence, but the illusion that he was always in command. And yet, this is where the possibility of transformation lies. For the man who can endure this confrontation with his shadow has the chance to become whole. Jung called it individuation, the union of shadow and self, the birth of authenticity. But such rebirth demands humility. It demands that he admits what his ego refuses to say, that he was dependent on your gaze, that his dominance was brittle, that the strength he paraded was often a mask. Few men accept this. Many will run from it, preferring the comfort of illusion to the pain of growth. And you, the woman who chose to leave, must resist the temptation to wait for his awakening. For it is not your role to see him through this trial. It is not your burden to heal the wound your absence revealed. Too often, women are conditioned to mistake his unraveling for a responsibility, to return, to soothe, to fix. But understand this: his shadow is not your destiny. His suffering is not your summons. You have done your part by holding the mirror, by refusing to remain a prisoner of his control. What happens after is his battle alone. Remember what Marcus Aurelius wrote: if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. He suffers not only because you left, but because he believes your leaving defines his worth, and if you are not vigilant, you too may fall into the illusion that his suffering defines your responsibility. But your freedom lies in detachment, in seeing that his shadow belongs to him, not you. This detachment is not cruelty, it is clarity. You chose not to lose yourself in the labyrinth of his ego. You chose not to carry his projections as if they were truths about you. You chose not to confuse his shame with your failure. By leaving first, you affirmed a truth he cannot yet grasp. Your worth is not measured by his ability to keep you, but by your willingness to walk when your soul is no longer nourished. And so, his ego hides behind masks, but masks cannot erase reality. The reality is this: he is left with himself. And though he may run from that fact, the shadow waits patiently, as shadows always do. For the woman, the lesson is already learned, that freedom begins the moment you refuse to remain where you are unseen. For the man, the lesson is yet to come. Whether he learns it or not is no longer yours to decide. As time stretches further from the moment you walked away, his ego begins to fracture in quieter, subtler ways. The grand gestures of distraction lose their shine. The loud proclamations of indifference ring hollow even to his own ears. The women he runs to cannot mirror him as you once did, because they are only spectators in a play whose script he has performed too many times. And in this exhaustion, he begins to taste the bitterness of reality. Power without presence is empty. Control without love is hollow. Conquest without depth is despair. This is the point where the shadow becomes undeniable. Jung described the shadow as everything the ego rejects, everything the conscious mind fears to own. For the man who has been left first, the shadow is filled with truths he has long buried: his fear of inadequacy, his terror of vulnerability, his hunger for validation dressed up as strength. He cannot admit these to the world. He may not even admit them to himself, but they follow him like a quiet ghost, appearing in restless dreams, in sudden irritations, in moments of inexplicable sorrow. And what does the ego do when confronted with this? It hides, it clings more desperately to illusion. He will tell himself stories to protect his pride, that you were weak, that you were impatient, that he never truly cared. But stories cannot silence the soul. The unconscious does not bow to pride. It waits, unrelenting, until the man is forced to face his inner landscape. Some never do. They repeat the cycle endlessly, mistaking repetition for progress, mistaking distraction for healing. But you, the woman who left, must hear this clearly. His failure to confront himself is not your burden to bear. His silence is not proof of strength. His quick replacement is not proof of your disposability. His accusations are not revelations of truth. They are defenses, projections, masks. You are not responsible for decoding his illusions. You are responsible only for protecting your own becoming. It is here that many women falter. The temptation to return grows when you see him unraveling. You imagine that perhaps your love could heal him, that perhaps your presence could soothe the wound you revealed. But this is the great trap. To return in that moment is not to heal him. It is to rescue his ego from the confrontation it most needs. You would only silence the lesson, allowing him to continue the cycle unchallenged, and in doing so, you would betray yourself. The Stoics remind us, no man is free who is not master of himself. When you leave first, you deliver him to the truth of his slavery, his dependence on control, on admiration, on external mirrors. His ego hides this slavery beneath masks of pride, but it is still slavery nonetheless. If he does not confront it, he will carry it into every future relationship, repeating the same play with new faces. Only if he chooses to face the shadow can he ever become free. For you, however, the path is already unfolding. By leaving, you have stepped into the fire of transformation. The loneliness that follows is not punishment, it is initiation. The silence that greets you is not emptiness, it is space. Space to hear your own voice again, to remember who you were before you became the mirror for his ego. Space to ask yourself what love feels like when it is not built on fear of leaving. You may ache for him still. That is natural. The soul does not release its bonds without mourning, but let your mourning become sacred, not desperate. Grief is not a signal to return, it is a sign of your depth. It means you loved, but loving does not mean staying when staying erodes your soul. Loving sometimes means leaving first, so that both can face their truths unmasked. And this is what his ego hides most fiercely from itself, that your departure was not abandonment but revelation. You revealed his fragility, his dependency, his shadow. You did not create these, you unveiled them. And though he may call you cruel or cold or heartless, understand his words are a shield, not a truth. The truth is that he was forced to meet himself, and that meeting shook him more than losing you ever could. So let him wrestle with his illusions. Let him cloak himself in pride or distraction. His journey is not yours to manage. Your journey is to walk forward, to grow roots in your own soil, to discover the freedom that begins when you no longer confuse his need for control with your duty to remain. For in leaving, you did not diminish yourself. You discovered your own horizon, and his ego, no matter how deeply it hides, knows this. You were the one who chose freedom. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.